Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to follow our member from Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie and speak today on this bill, but I do want to say right at the offset that I feel shameful, actually, that we're here having to debate this legislation. This is really the first order of business that's come from the Conservative government, is to force workers back to work and not give them a fair shot and a fair chance at collective bargaining. And I actually want to remember when I was first elected in 1997, and in December of that year, we faced a similar situation of back-to-work legislation for the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. And what's ironic, though, is that, of course, at that time it was a Liberal government, and the legislation that we're dealing with today is very, very similar to the legislation that we dealt with in 1997. It's the same incredible, outrageous fines, $50,000 for union leaders, $100,000 for the union as a whole that was in the Liberal legislation, the same kind of restraints on the arbitrator that we see in the legislation today. And in fact, back then, too, it was a lower wage that was actually legislated, a wage restraint, than what had actually been at the bargaining table. So it's been ironic for me to hear some of the Liberal members get up and say how they feel about this legislation when they forget their own history of what they did in 1997. So I just wanted to remember that, because I was a new member at that time in 1997, and remember that debate that also went through the night. Mr. Speaker, I want to begin by saying thank you to postal workers. I think they've had a really rough ride from the Conservative members in this House. They've been vilified, they've been demonized, they've been set up as the bad guys, and when in reality that this union and the members of that union, what they want is a fair collective agreement. They don't want to see back-to-work legislation. They're willing to go back to the table. But look at the circumstances that are now unfolding. We have a government, a Conservative government, who is using a sledgehammer and putting forward legislation by this motion number 3 that we're now debating that will actually put them in such a constraint in terms of any collective bargaining that we might as well say goodbye to collective bargaining. And I want to reference that because some of the Conservative members have said, well, you know, this is only about this situation. It's only about the postal workers. It doesn't affect anybody else other than, of course, they're reading out messages from various people. But the fact is that this back-to-work legislation affects all workers in this country. And it may surprise members to know that Canada is even today not a signatory to one of the very important international labor organization, the ILO Conventions number 98, which is the Right to Organize and Collective Bargaining Convention. We're not even a signatory to that. And so that right is not even enshrined in terms of Canadian practice. And so is it any wonder that we see this assault on Canadian workers? And what happens to these workers is a signal what's yet to come. And so for that reason, we should be deeply disturbed and concerned about this legislation and how it will affect other workers, whether they're under a collective agreement or not. Mr. Speaker, the other issue that I think we have to be very concerned about is the implication and impact on pensions. You know, every Canadian is concerned about what's going to happen to their pension system. And one of the issues in this particular round of bargaining is the employer trying to change the pension system so that workers will no longer have an assurance of what it is they can expect from their pension when they retire. This is a very basic value to all Canadian workers, again, whether they're unionized or not. And for this employer, which happens to be a crown corporation controlled by the government, to run the gauntlet and lay this down and say we're going to change the pension system is really a warning sign of what's to come. So I can say for us as New Democrats, we know that we've got to fight this tooth and nail with the labour movement, with progressive people in this country, because we can see the signal and we can see the direction that this government is taking. In addition to that, one of the proposals that the union has had to deal with is facing a two-tier wage system. And again, you know, this is about an employer now supported by a government that is trying to put a wage restraint through legislation. I think it's pretty outrageous when the government itself tables a proposal in the legislation that will actually decrease the wages that were actually on the table by the employer, which in itself was for starting workers 20% lower than existing postal workers. So we can see where this is going. So I find it very ironic that we have a government that says it's interested in economic recovery and stability on the one hand, but on the other hand, everything that they are doing is actually driving wages down, driving down working conditions and making things actually less secure and more difficult for workers, whether they're unionized or not. So, Mr. Speaker, these are all elements of this back-to-work legislation, and so the idea that it's a one-off piece of legislation and we don't have to worry about it, I think in the debate that's unfolding now today and will go on for several days, it will be very clear that there are much, much broader implications for all workers in this country, and it's something that we should be concerned about. Mr. Speaker, today in the House I tabled two bills, private members' bills, relating to what we call social condition, and that is that recognition that people who are poor, people who are low income face discrimination based on their economic circumstance. And in my mind, I see a relationship between the tabling of those bills and what we're trying to do in removing discrimination from people who are economically disadvantaged or living below the poverty line, and what the government is trying to do in this back-to-work legislation. Because the fact of the matter is that when you have public policy that is going in a direction that is taking away people's rights, that's driving down wages, that's saying we won't tolerate collective bargaining, that does affect everybody. When unions do well, when wages go up, when minimum wages go up, that actually is something that benefits all workers in this country, including people who are living below the poverty line and who are trying to struggle on a minimum wage of whether it might be $8 or $9 or $10 an hour, depending on where you live. So these issues are related, and again, we can see that that this legislation that's coming forward tonight, after we vote tonight, and presumably this motion is going to go through today, it will have a huge impact not only on the members of CUPW, but on workers as a whole. And I know that those in the labour movement are watching this with very keen interest and are very concerned about what it is that's taking place. I noticed that one such union member, Fred Wilson, who works at the CEP, noted in a blog that he put on rabble.ca, and he says, the Conservatives have rigged this game completely. The outcome is now determined. There is nothing left for free collective bargaining to accomplish. And, Mr. Speaker, I would certainly echo those comments and feel, again, that sense of shame and that sense of distress about the road that we're going down. The government really, they did not have to intervene. We hear so often they don't like to intervene in the marketplace. They don't like to make those interventions. Why is it in this case that they decided to make that intervention on the side of Canada Post? Why is it that they haven't said anything about the lockout that's taking place of those workers? We've heard Conservative member after Conservative member get up and attack the union, attack those who are trying to get just a fair deal with their employer, and yet I haven't heard one word from any of those members looking at the employer and what it is that they've done here. And the reality is that we now see a government that's backing up that employer, that's saying, well, we're on side with you 100%. So where's the balance? Where is the idea that the fairness should exist? So, Mr. Speaker, we're very opposed to this motion today. We're opposed to this process of bringing in closure on the bill that will be before us tonight. We stand and believe in collective bargaining. We stand for the rights of workers to have a fair shot and a fair deal as outlined outlined by the International Labour Organization. We support Convention 98, as all people in this country should do, and we demand of the government that they respect those rights and that they think about their position that they're taking here and what it is that they're imposing in such an unfair and discriminatory manner. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.